So, good afternoon. I'm Gail Brewer, Manhattan Borough President. I want to welcome to our office, and particularly, in a minute, I want to thank the Commissioner for being here. But this, as you know, is a forum on the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. We call them the new rent laws, thank goodness, in Albany. That's my version of it. I think many of you are and will always be housing advocates, attorneys, paralegals, organizers. You know housing policy from the front line and from every single day. But for me, I know this will be helpful to know exactly what passed in Albany and how it is evolving. I've never heard of it called the HSTPA. I just call it the rent laws that passed in 2019. And they're complicated, and some of it are waiting to be clarified through the agency HCR. I still call it DHCR, but I'm not supposed to call it HCR. And the leadership that this amazing commissioner, whom I'll talk about in a minute, has played in terms of these laws. I want to thank you for the work that you do. I think that these laws are the culmination of decades of tenant organizing and advocacy work. We just lucked out in terms of the timing. A lot of work went into the individuals who were there to vote, but it was incredibly important. We shouldn't forget that it's the result of advocates telling everyone in government what it's really like on the ground in terms of tenants, the real protections that tenants need to be free from harassment and the threat of displacement. I'll tell you one story. I had a woman call me up because I think I have 311 written on my forehead. And she called, "Gail, I'm very upset with you." I said, "What's wrong?" She says, "Well, I wanted to move to Florida, and I can only get bought out if my landlord thinks he can get market." I said, "Too bad. You don't go to Florida, and you're not going to get bought out. Goodbye." I've never had a call like that before. But today's goal is to facilitate an opportunity for everyone to learn more and get answers about the rent laws that passed. And I have to say, I can't think of any person better to explain it than the HCR, DHCR Commissioner Ruth Ann Versosos. I think also we'll have Deputy Commissioner Pascal and the entire team from HCR, including a little baby over there, wherever she is. I know that there's a baby here who knows a lot. I want to say that this commissioner, her team were instrumental as something special in addition to the rent laws that passed and even before the rent laws passed, in keeping the Lakeview apartments in East Harlem affordable for the long term. It was much thanks to this amazing commissioner that Mitchell-Lama ended up with project-based Section 8 with higher subsidies that made the owner agree to the deal without getting into all the specifics. It was very complicated, and it's hundreds and hundreds of units overlooking something called Central Park. They could have gone the other way, so thank you. She was appointed by the governor in 2017 in February to head up this agency. And before that, she was appointed, or maybe at the same time, President CEO of HFA, also known as Housing Finance Agency, which of course does a lot with mortgages. She certainly has served in many important positions. She was Executive Deputy Commissioner for Housing Development at HCR, and there she did strategy, leadership, and oversight of multifamily housing finance programs, which I think was really helpful when we were trying to deal with the Mitchell-Lamas. I just wish we had been able to say all the Mitchell-Lamas. She was managing director of the Housing Advisory Board for the Robin Hood Foundation, which of course we know is one of the larger foundations in New York and does an awful lot for fighting not just against poverty, but for affordable housing. She had several positions in HPD, Housing Preservation and Development, including commissioner from September 2014 to February 2015. I think we all know the importance of HPD, particularly in terms of the Housing Maintenance Code. But she was there when Vito was there, so she was very lucky to have Vito by her side. She was Deputy Commissioner for Development, also at HPD, working on the Preserving City Neighborhoods Initiative, which was designed to purchase the notes of over-leveraged buildings and stabilizing them by sending them to nonprofits. She has a BA from University of Pennsylvania and urban planning from the Wagner School at NYU. She lives in Manhattan. So I work for her with her family. So thank you very much. Without further ado, the person who really knows something is our commissioner from HCR. Thank you very much, Ruth Ann.
Sure. My name is Ruth Ann Wisniewskis. Can you all hear me? Is this on? I know. I don't feel like it's. I'm going to go really close. Is it with an F or a PH? It's with a V, like Valentine. Wisniewskis. It's Lithuanian.
Is that on? Yeah, it's on.
You can hear me? Okay. It's Lithuanian. I think I'm the only Lithuanian state housing commissioner probably so far. I don't actually really know. I just think there's not that many Lithuanians here. I'm sorry you had to read my entire bio, Gail. That really seemed too long. But I will add that I brought with me today my 4-year-old son, who I'm trying to get to learn this PowerPoint so that he can do it besides me. Nico, can you raise your hand? Can you raise your hand and say hi? Yes. He's here to learn what I do and mostly just to memorize. So we sometimes call this, Gail, Hetzpah.
I know, but that's not, like, I never heard that before.
I know, it sounds like I sneezed, right? A little bit? But all joking aside, my name is Ruth Ann Wisniewskis. I am the state housing commissioner for New York State Homes and Community Renewal, and I'm delighted to be here today alongside Gail Brewer, of whom I am a giant fan, as I'm sure many of you in this room are, to discuss the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. We were incredibly excited about this law because it strengthened the rent laws and provides greater affordability both in New York City and also around the whole state, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We think about the law in 3 different ways. 1, it strengthened the existing rent laws. 2, it removed the geographic restriction on the rent laws, which means they are now available around the state, which is tremendous. And 3, it provides additional protections, for renters across the state. And I'll talk in detail about those. There has been a lot of uncertainty since the laws went into effect in June. So today I'm here to tell you a little bit about the laws, about how HCR is implementing them, and then I'm also happy to hear your questions after that. Some questions we can answer, others we're in the process of answering, but we are happy to engage. As the borough president said, I'm here, joined here today by the head of the Office of Rent Administration, Woody Pascal, who is the person who most people know and I think associate with the other person people call besides Gail, maybe for 311, the other person they call all the time is Woody to ask him all sorts of questions. And I will just tell you before I start to say that we are working very hard at HCR since June to get these laws implemented and to make sure that material is available to the public so people understand what do they mean, both sort of real time and also in the long run. And we appreciate the partnership of the Borough President's Office and really all the electeds in doing that. So without further ado, I will start with what is rent regulation. So I know all of you probably know this, but it doesn't hurt to sort of remind a little bit. So there are many communities, New York City and the surrounding boroughs previously, that were only able to have either rent control or rent stabilization. There are about 950,000 units in 45,000 buildings across New York City and the suburbs that fall under rent stabilization. And as I had said, all these laws for these buildings are governed by our Office of Rent Administration. The system itself is intended to protect tenants in privately owned buildings from illegal rent increases and also allow owners to invest in and maintain their buildings. Rent control generally applies to buildings built before 1947, and rent stabilization generally covers buildings built after 1947, before 1974. Outside New York City, when we talk about rent stabilization, we refer to it by its sort of legal name, which is the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, ETPA, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, since we're in Manhattan, I brought a map. So there are about 266,000 rent-stabilized units in the borough of Manhattan. They're spread over about 14,000 buildings. And as you can see, they are in basically all of Manhattan. In some of the other boroughs, there's more concentrations than you have here. The median number of rent-stabilized apartments in a rent-stabilized building in New York City, so that means the midpoint, so half of those buildings have 8 or more units, and half of them have 8 or less. and the average number of units in a rent-stabilized building in Manhattan is 18. So that's just sort of some context. In terms of community districts, so you can see here, more than 18% of rent-stabilized units in Manhattan are in a single community district, the most northern of Inwood and Washington Heights. And as you can see, actually all the way down at the bottom, I think is the district that has the least. Probably not something you all maybe would have thought, but there it is in a map. And as I'd said before, what is the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act? So we, in terms of strengthening the existing rent laws, there were sort of 5 big things that happened, and I'll go through them individually, which include removing the decontrol threshold, changing the preferential rent structure, changes to MCIs and IAIs, and I'll talk through those one by one. And then on the right side, this sort of talks about some of the additional benefits for all renters around security deposits, around eviction, and I'll talk about those in a little more detail in a minute. So I'll go through now the actual rent laws and the changes in the big, which is mostly all of the categories, but in the kind of the big categories, starting with high rent, high income decontrol. So this is the big one, right? So previously when an apartment reached $2,700, or $2,744 in the last year, the apartments could deregulate and come out of the system. So the decontrol threshold was eliminated. So no apartments that are rent-stabilized apartments can now be deregulated just by virtue of going over that $2,700 rent threshold. In addition, an apartment could be deregulated if a tenant was a high-income tenant and had that high income for more than 2 years while they were in place in the apartment. So in addition to the threshold being eliminated, you also cannot deregulate when a tenant has high income. Sorry, and let me go back for a second. On each of these slides, you'll see this blue box that says Updated Fact Sheet 26. So at HCR and at the Office of Rent Administration, we don't send emails to every rent-stabilized tenant in the city of New York because we don't have everyone's email. So we communicate by forms that we call fact sheets that we try to make very clear explanation of the law. We also have other types of administrative documents, but we put them all on our website. We try to put examples in them so people can understand what they mean. But on each of these slides, you can see where there's that little blue box. It's just telling you if you wanted to sort of know more about this, you can go to our website and go to the fact sheet that's listed, and it will explain what's going on. Okay, so the next one is vacancy increase, and that was repealed. So previously, when an apartment had a vacancy, a landlord could raise the rent 20%. The law has changed, and now landlords can only increase the legal rent by the Rent Guidelines Board, what the Rent Guidelines Board determines. And so that's a big change as well. This one, which sort of goes with it, which is the longevity increase. So previously, when a tenant stayed in place for a long time, a landlord could get an additional increase to the vacancy increase depending on how many years that tenant was in place. And so that's now been eliminated, and there is no longer a longevity increase allowed for landlords upon apartment turnover. So preferential rents. This was a big one that I think impacted a lot of people, in which there had been some changes historically that the law fixed. So previously, a landlord can give a tenant a rent that is less than the legal rent, and that's called a preferential rent. Rent, however, upon lease renewal, the landlord could move that preferential rent anywhere in between the preferential rent and the legal rent. So while the Rent Guidelines Board were passing increases of 2% for 1 year and 3% for 2 years, whatever they determined, in fact, many people who had a preferential rent were subject to increases that were bigger because the rent could go anywhere between the preferential rent and the legal rent. So the law has now been changed, and for anyone who has a lease where that lease effective date was the date of the law, June 14th, 2019, the landlord cannot raise the rent by more than the Rent Guidelines Board increase on lease renewal when you have a preferential rent. MCIs. So MCIs, major capital improvements, are generally thought of as large sort of system-wide improvements that landlords make to buildings, which they can then submit to ORA, to HCR for processing, and then the cost of that major capital improvement is passed along to tenants in the rent. So there were a lot of changes in the law around MCIs. I'll just go sort of in order that they are on the right-hand side of this. So previously, if a rent increase was, depending on the dollar value of the rent increase, you could increase a tenant's rent by 6% for the MCI. Now you can only increase a tenant's rent by 2% for the MCI. So you can get an RGB increase, and then you can get an up to 2% increase for your MCI. So it greatly reduces the rent increases as a result of MCIs. Secondly, the 2% cap applies now. So if you were in a multi-year MCI increase, so you're going kind of in steps, and you would have gotten a 4% increase this year for that MCI, that 2% cap is in place. And so there will be no more MCI increases that are greater than 2% subsequent to the law changing. The other sort of two big things is that previously an MCI had stayed on the rent permanently, and now MCIs only stay on the apartment rent for a period of 30 years, and then they come off. So they're no longer permanent.
How many years?
30. And I'll go to IAIs next, which is a similar structure. So individual apartment improvements were allowed by landlords to make improvements specifically in an apartment. So this is not where an MCI is windows and boilers and roofs and major capital improvements that impact the whole building. An IAI was an improvement just in an individual apartment. So a kitchen, a bathroom, floors, other types of in-apartment improvements. Most IAIs that were filed or that were taken by landlords were taken at vacancy. So when a tenant would move out, a landlord would do often, a large renovation, and there was no cap to that amount. They would then apply a formula to the amount that they spent and add that to the rent. So a couple of changes. So the amount that they can spend to renovate the apartment is now $15,000 over a 15-year period. And they can only do 3 IAIs that add up to that $15,000. So previously there was no cap, and now it's $15,000. Just like MCIs, IAIs are also no longer permanent. So at the end of 30 years, they come off the rent. The increases are also no longer, previously there was a little bit of this, but it is now strengthened where you can't take an IAI where there are outstanding hazardous or immediately hazardous violations. And lastly, the law required that HCR create a centralized database. So now landlords have to document the IAIs both before and after, photos and description of work and bills, and they have to upload it into a database so that those records are maintained. It is not a public database. So I just touch on rent control for a second because you do have some rent control apartments in Manhattan, but there were 2 big changes to the rents for rent control apartments. So one is that fuel pass-along charges are no longer allowed. And the second one is that rather than the rents being subject to the maximum base rent formula, the rent increases are now going to be the average of the 5 most recent Rent Guideline Board annual increases for 1-year leases. That was like so many words to describe that. But basically, it's going to take an average of the RGB increases so that to set what the rent increases are for rent control apartments, which is a much more, I think, transparent way to understand than previously where there was a somewhat complicated formula that applied to rent control apartments. Mm-hmm.
How do you figure the increase? What will it come to? 5%, 4%?
So let's hold that, and we can answer that. We're going to do questions at the end, but that's a good question, and somebody on my team can write that down, and then we'll answer that when we get to questions. But that's great. Happy for you to raise it while we're on the topic. There were a couple other very substantial changes to the rent law. So previously, the rent laws sunsetted and expired, and had to get renegotiated by the legislature every 4 years, typically. So now the laws do not automatically expire. They will be in existence, and they don't. There's no sunset, which is the sort of technical term. The second one is that the geographic limitation of rent stabilization only being allowed in New York City and Nassau, Rockland, and Westchester County was the limitation. That has now been lifted, and rent stabilization is available statewide. But I'll talk a little more about what it means for the rest of the state to actually opt in, but there's no more limitation. And the third big change is that previously, when there was a rent overcharge, HCR looked back 4 years to determine whether there was an overcharge in rent. The law was changed to say that we have to look back 6 years or until we can find a last reliable rent. And so landlords, I think, are on notice now to sort of make sure they are maintaining records so that we can go back 6 or more years. And also the treble damage liability period was extended to 6 years as well. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit for a minute, less relevant for Manhattan, but also just sort of good to understand that when the geographic limitation was lifted from the rent laws, what it means is that localities upstate need to do a survey to determine whether they have a housing emergency, which means they have a vacancy rate of less than 5% in a specific subset of their rental housing. So if they know and they can prove through a study that they have a rental emergency, housing emergency, then they can opt into rent regulation as well. They will set up their own county level rent guidelines boards and follow all the rules that are set for the rest of the municipalities that are currently in rent regulation. As you know, probably, but worth reminding, the obligations that landlords have to tenants when you are in rent stabilization and in ETPA is that landlords have to submit required documentation to HCR every year, including registration statements for every regulated apartment in their building. They are limited to increasing their rents, as you know, by the percentages set by the Rent Guidelines Board every year. They are generally obligated to offer 1 or 2 year lease renewals to each tenant prior to the expiration of their current lease. And landlords are required to maintain their apartments in accordance with standards that are both set forth in the laws as well as local building and housing maintenance laws. So the thing about all those requirements means that when a landlord fails to follow those elements of the law, tenants then file cases with the Office of Rent Administration, whether that's for services, for a rent overcharge, for a lease renewal violation, whatever it may be. We are then the sort of like a little mini court where you can file with us and we then adjudicate if someone believes that the law has not been followed by their landlord. Just a note on some of the benefits that are for all tenants, not just those in rent stabilized apartments, but all tenants, is that security deposits will be limited to 1 month's rent. That has been true for rent stabilized apartments, but now it is true for all rental apartments. The law banned the use of tenant screening bureaus, which had previously prevented people from finding apartments when landlords collected lists of tenants. It expands the ability of the court to stay evictions. As many people know, eviction is a very difficult and can be very traumatic experience for individuals and for families. So the law was changed to allow more time in that process for people to both pay back rent and also find other apartments. And lastly, it also prohibits landlords from evicting tenants who file complaints based on code violations. So everyone deserves to live in a habitable apartment, and if you file against your landlord for that, that is not something that a landlord can bring you to court for. So operationalizing the law. So HCR, about a year or so ago, launched a website called New York State Rent Connect, and that is the web address at the bottom, trying to be more user-friendly for people, as lots of people today are interacting and doing a lot of their business on their phone. We wanted to make sure that we could catch up with some of that also. So we now have a website, which you can access on a computer, but also on a phone, that allows tenants and owners to file lease issues, overcharge complaints, defective conditions, and also registrations. You can also file responses to an MCI case. So if a landlord files an MCI, you can, in fact, when you want to respond to that as a tenant, you can go in on your phone or go in on the website and do it. You don't have to fill paper or go to a borough rent office to file that. And we also have forms and records and general sort of Q&A on there for people to be able to access documents that they may need. So a couple other points outside of my PowerPoint, I would say, are that the laws continue to evolve. So there are many cases that are going through the court as we speak and that get decided every day and every month that shape the laws. And so while we are the implementer of the laws, they continue to evolve, and that will continue over time as additional cases go through. And so it's important for people to realize that it isn't sort of a static set of laws. It really is dynamic. The other thing and I think it's on my next slide here. Oh, I would say is that we have tried very hard to get the most important documents up on our website as we can. So we did them in what we felt was in order of importance. If there are documents that are not up there that you need, please reach out to us, and we are happy to try to expedite getting up documents that are important to people. Two other things. One is that the HCR issues regulations that are the more detailed version of the rent laws, and they are subject to public comment. So those regulations will be issued this year for public comment, and we encourage the public to comment on them, and are happy to take feedback and input on those. And lastly, one of the elements of the law that we touched on earlier was major capital improvements, and the law requires us to create a schedule of costs for major capital improvements, and we are in the process of doing that, and that should be up on our, should be completed and up on our website by the deadline, which is June of this year, 1 year after the rent laws were passed.